There was a 5-year study presented in May of 2008 looking at emergency department radiation dose, in which they found that patients received an average dose of 45 millisieverts, which is the equivalent of 2,250 chest x-rays, and that 12% of those patients received 100 or more millisieverts, which would be the equivalent of more than 5,000 chest x-rays. So we are radiating people at a very high rate, especially in emergency departments, and it's important for all physicians, emergency department physicians, and even patients to understand that you don't want to get a CT scan unless you need it. On the other hand, a CT scan can be a life-saving examination. It can be an examination that prevents unnecessary surgery. So we do want to use it, we just want to use it appropriately. In a survey of referring physicians, particularly this is a survey looking at pediatric referring physicians, it was also found that the physicians had a difficult time understanding radiation risk. 6% indicated a lifetime radiation risk, only 87% and 87% underestimated the risk for all types of radiation, 94% underestimated the CT risks, 8% incorrectly thought that ultrasound involved radiation, indicating that at least a significant number of physicians don't really understand the basic technology, and 12% indicated no radiation risk from nuclear medicine. And nuclear obviously implies that there should be some radiation involved. So I think that there's obviously a need for some basic education on the different types of examinations that are performed. Now, why is this so difficult? Why is this such a hard topic? Well, in part, it's what I refer to as the radiation alphabet soup. Radiation is measured in terms of Röntgens, it's measured in terms of rads, it's measured in terms of REMS, it's also measured in grays, and it's measured in sieverts. And people use different types of measurements depending on what their training, what type of training they've had, or what type of environment they're in. And that makes it extremely difficult. It makes it extremely difficult for physicians and radiation specialists to compare this technology, much less for individuals who do not work specifically in this field or non-healthcare professionals. One of the things that was recommended at the ALARA conference that was held and reported in 2002, and ALARA again standing for as low as reasonably achievable, meaning we want to keep the radiation dose as low as we can. One of the things that was reported was that there was a need for a common dose metric, an effective dose, something that would allow you to compare across modalities to see between one examination and another what the radiation dose is in a way that people could easily understand. One of those modalities that's been suggested is to use the chest x-ray equivalent. The chest x-ray equivalent in this particular instance is a PA chest x-ray equivalent, and part of the reason for that is that a PA chest x-ray examination dose is about the same in everyone because most of the radiation is going through air, through your lungs. A lateral chest x-ray, depending on whether you're a very large person or a very small person, you may get a significantly different dose, but the PA dose, the dose that goes through your lungs, is about the same for everyone. So one PA chest x-ray equivalent gives us a common dose metric. When we look at that, and you look at this graph, you can see the difference between a single PA chest x-ray and, for example, a whole body CT screening examination. The single PA chest x-ray being 1, the whole body CT scanning being 2,000, and you can also see the variety of differences in radiation dose of different types of procedures, and this gives us a way to then assess some of the risk and benefit that occurs when we perform these examinations. Now, we have a textbook on this topic, which is now in its 4th edition, called The Medical Imaging Consultant, that specifically addresses for referring physicians, radiologists, and even patients the differences between these procedures and the radiation dose, as well as some of the reasons for performing these examinations. This book is divided into key sections. Each page is basically a table. Allows you to understand the CPT code, the procedure, the anatomy, the chest x-ray equivalents, the Medicare allowable cost, various risks and benefits, and comments on the different types of procedures to be performed. The idea behind this textbook is it allows individuals to compare different procedures and their risks and benefits when these are being ordered or if an individual is deciding whether or not to undergo one of these examinations. Now, in addition to the idea of the radiation dose at the ALARA conference was asked why not compute an estimated cancer morbidity risk and actually put it on the screen. This text actually does that. It actually computes the cancer risk. It computes it in days of life lost, and allows you to evaluate the potential loss of life, days of life that can be associated with different radiation risks. Now, there's no perfect resource. The Pocket Medical Imaging Consultant is obviously not a perfect resource. It's updated at least annually, and anyone who wants to participate and provide information that is based on medical literature for improving the text can do so, and they will be offered a position as to be recognized in the textbook if we elect to use what they provide us. In most instances, if there is medical literature to back suggestions, we typically will include those and include the individual as an acknowledgement in the book. And we need to keep this risk in perspective. This sort of sounds a little bit like a scare tactic. Okay, radiation is bad, you don't want to get any radiation. If you get radiation, you might get cancer. Well, the truth of the matter is there are all kinds of risks that we're exposed to. Most people, wherever they are right now watching this, got there in an automobile of some type. That's usually the case. And the chances that you would be killed in an automobile going to or from wherever you are right now is about 1 in 6,000 in the United States. So just traveling is not without some risk. We've already looked at the fact that a pediatric CT scan can result in, one pediatric CT scan can result in a death as frequent as 1 in 1,200. If you're the age 45, it's about 1 in 1,250. Age 65, about 1 in 1,700. If you're age 45 and you had a screening CT scan every year until you're 75, that would be 30 CT scans. That would give you a risk of developing cancer from those CT scans of about 1 in 50. If you're age 60 and you had one every year for the next 15 years, it would be about 1 in 200. But the sad statistic that exists, at least in the United States today, is that 1 in 5 people will die of cancer anyway in the United States regardless. So we certainly don't want to increase people's cancer risk by doing unnecessary radiation procedures, but we also need to bear in mind that there's a very, very high incidence of cancer in the United States anyway. We don't want to add to that, but we also need to detect it, we need to treat it, we need to take care of these people. So we have to balance this. It's a balance between the risk and the benefit, which is really what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that individuals are going to get cancer. We don't want to increase their risk, but we also want to be careful that we don't cause them to unnecessarily go undiagnosed. So we have to balance this. And we want to be also particularly careful in younger individuals and women when we use radiation. And that's what this slide, if you'll remember from the beginning, when I said this is the most important slide, that's the point I'd most like to make, is we want to be very careful in younger individuals and in females when we use radiation, because they're the ones that are at the greatest risk. Now, there are generally 2 theories in radiation exposure, and one of them is called the linear no threshold, which is that any increment of exposure above natural background levels will produce a linear increment of risk. That's what we've been talking about up until now. But this is not universally accepted. There are individuals who actually believe that low-dose radiation may have benefit. That's referred to as hormesis. The idea of a net benefit from low-dose radiation is referred to as hormesis. Now, the major argument in favor of hormesis is epidemiological studies showing that populations exposed to low-dose radiation over long periods of time tend to live longer. For example, British radiologists had longer lifespans after 1920 than other physicians. Now, non-radiologist physicians were also shown to smoke more. They also had higher stress levels because non-radiologist physicians, particularly during that time frame, had a significantly higher stress level than radiologists. So there are a number of factors that could be involved in that. Another study that's been pointed to, showing that populations exposed to low-dose radiation live longer, are U.S. nuclear shipyard workers. There have been a lot of studies done on the nuclear shipyard workers with a variety of results. However, one of the things that we have to be aware of is something called a healthy worker effect. Workers generally demonstrate greater health and longevity than the general population that includes non-workers. So basically the idea is if you're active and you're working, you tend to live longer than individuals who don't work. One example of this population is ethylene oxide workers, workers in the petroleum industry, and garment workers. All tend to live longer than the general population. However, these individuals are exposed to ethylene oxide, hydrocarbons, textile fibers, dust, and formaldehyde. Most people, I think, would recognize that ethylene oxide, hydrocarbons, textile fibers, dust, and formaldehyde are probably not health promoters, probably would not expect those individuals to do better, yet they tend to live longer. It's probably because they're actively working. The same thing could be applied to radiation workers. The main argument that proponents have to suggest that acute low-dose radiation is helpful is that they say it induces a protective response against the normal DNA damage that all of us are having all the time. As I'm sitting here talking to you right now, as you're listening to me, we have DNA damage occurring in us all the time. And if that DNA damage is serious enough, it might result in cancer. Now, radiobiologists have a fundamental objection to that argument in that they say that the endogenous DNA damage, the damage that's occurring to us all the time, consists of base damage and single-strand breaks, meaning that it's fairly simple types of damage to the DNA. Whereas ionizing radiation, they point out, induces more than just simple and single-strand breaks. It induces double-strand breaks and more complex types of lesions in the DNA, and they say that those are the lesions that initiate radiation-induced cancer. So it's not very feasible from the radiobiology standpoint that this DNA argument accounts for a decreased risk when you have radiation. Their argument would be that it increases the risk. Now, regardless of which side an individual would fall on that argument, it's important to know where the major agencies whose job is to observe these things and give recommendations fall. These agencies, the International Commission on Radiologic Protection, the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, the Radiation Protection Division of the Health Protection Agency of Great Britain, and the National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements of the United States have all come out and stated that any increment of exposure above natural background levels will produce a linear increment of risk, the so-called linear no-threshold model, meaning that any radiation that you get that is increased over what your background rate is where you live, because we're all exposed to radiation. We have cosmic radiation that comes from the atmosphere and from the sun, from outer space, and through the atmosphere we get cosmic radiation. We get radiation from buildings that are around us, from mountains, from all types of places there's radiation. So we all have a background radiation dose. But basically what this comment is stating is that anything that you get above that increases your base cancer risk. And we know when we're taking care of people, we want to make a habit of two things: to help them or at least do no harm.